Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Injustice podcast. I'm your host, David Greenwald. For the past 10 years, we have operated Vanguard court watches in California, including San Francisco, Sacramento, and Yolo counties. Our goal? Expose everyday court injustices, and now, more broadly, shine a spotlight on injustices in the entire criminal justice system, in the form of wrongful convictions, police and prosecutorial misconduct, and mass incarceration. This podcast hopes to take it a step further and highlight criminal justice reform on a national level.
Everyday injustice.
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Steve Raphael. He is one of the co-authors of the report from the California Policy Lab on three strikes in California. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, in your opinion, what are the key findings of this report?
So our report largely focuses on trying to understand how frequently three strikes is used in sentences that result in a prison sentence, and who is impacted more, what are the types of sentences or the offenses that people are receiving three strike enhancements for, and then also whether it's having an impact on public safety. And basically what we're finding is that if you look at people admitted to prison, it's something on the order of about 27% of prisons have their prison sentences have their sentence lengthened because of an enhancement under the law. And at any given point in time, it's about 35% of inmates in California are serving a sentence that's lengthened due to a three strikes enhancement. We're finding that three strikes, given that the way it operates is for a second strike, or if you have one prior serious or violent offense and you're convicted of any subsequent felony, that could lead to a doubling of your sentence. And for people who have two prior serious or violence that get a third serious or violent conviction, get an indeterminate 25 years to life sentence. And what we're seeing is that many people who are sentenced under this law, and in particular for the doubling for a second offense, are receiving enhancements for offenses that are not serious or violent. And then I guess the final main finding that we're getting, or that we're finding in the study, is we did a thorough literature review of research on whether three strikes caused any impact on crime rates. There's some researchers that have hypothesized that it would cause large deterrent effects given the severity of enhancement. There are other researchers that have hypothesized that it might actually have a perverse effect on crime. If people are trying to avoid a third conviction, they may be violent in the process of trying to avoid detection or apprehension by the police. And we basically conclude from the research and our own analysis of crime trends in California that the law probably didn't have much of an impact on crime rates in the state. Crime did fall in California following the passage, but it also fell in other states that did not pass such laws. And that's pretty much it. So those are our kind of main takeaways.
So was there anything that particularly surprised you about your findings?
There are some things that well, I don't know if they were necessarily surprising, but I did find them interesting. So we spent a lot of time contrasting the findings that we're getting in our report from an analysis done by the Legislative Analyst's Office in 2005 of three strikes when it had been in effect for roughly 10 years. And one of the things we do see is that largely due to a reform that happened in 2012, the most severe sentence under three strikes is actually considerably less rare now than it was in the past. So the 25-year to life sentence prior to the passage of Prop 36 applied to any third felony conviction for people who had two prior serious or violent offenses. And that was amended to narrowly be applied to a third conviction that is for a third strike, with a few exceptions. And that actually led to a large reduction in the use of that offense for people with that particular aspect of their criminal history. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. And another thing that we saw, which I guess, perhaps it's not surprising, but it's a salient pattern, is that there's a lot of heterogeneity across counties in the propensity to use the sentence. So DAs have discretion in terms of whether they're going to, sort of request sentences that are enhanced by 3 strikes. And some counties use it more than others. And that ranking appears to be relatively stable over time. So the counties that tended to use it a lot in 2005 also tend to use it relatively more now, and vice versa.
Interesting. So I'm going to unpack a few of these kind of critical findings. I mean, did you see the share of the prison population as being surprisingly high, or is that about what you expected?
Well, it is about what I expected. So, I mean, well, there's an interesting contrast that occurs, and so you get slightly different reads on the proportion of the prison population that are impacted by how you define that population. So, if we look at people admitted to prison, it's about 26% that have an enhanced sentence due to 3 strikes, and mostly for doubled sentences for a subsequent felony. And it's a small percent, under 1%, that get the life, 25 to life term for a third serious violent. But when you look at the prison population at a given point in time, the percentage is somewhat larger. It's about 35%, and in particular, the percentage that are doing times for a third strike sentence is larger. It's about 7.5% of the prison population. And basically what's going on there is when you take a snapshot of a population that is dynamically changing, where people are entering and leaving at any given point in time, you tend to sort of capture people in that snapshot that are disproportionately in the midst of long spells, right? And that you see that in other settings. So for example, if you survey the people who are homeless on a given day, you tend to find people who are in the midst of long spells and the characteristics associated with that. And that's not representative of the people who will experience homelessness over the course of a year. So we see that in the prison population too. And, while we weren't surprised, it does really suggest of how important, of all the enhancements that we have to criminal sentencing in California, 3 strikes seems to be the one that really has a lot of bite, that it's used frequently and it adds a lot of years. So a typical, the way sentences are constructed, so to speak, in California are, each sentence carries with it sort of 3 potential offenses. So they're sometimes referred to as the sentencing triad, where you'll have a lower, a middle, and an upper, and the presumption is, absent extenuating or mitigating circumstances, that the middle sentence will be applied. The default sentence for offenses is 16, 24, and 36 months, but lots of sentences have longer and sometimes shorter, depending on what's specified in statute. So, if the default is 24 months for medium sentence, a second strike enhancement basically adds 2 years, right? Which is quite severe. And if the offense is more serious and has a triad that's higher, then obviously more years will be added. And then, of course, the 25 to life sentence really adds a lot of years, right? Because you'll have folks who will have a triad that is considerably lower, and then the indeterminate 25 to life kind of supersedes that, and that becomes the dominant sentence. And then, of course, people are going to be in prison for decades. One of the things we were seeing when we were just comparing the characteristics of these different sort of groups of people in state prison was that people who are sentenced to a third strike sentence, when you look at them currently, they're, considerably older than the average inmate in California because of the length of time they've been there. And, a large fraction of them have been in prison for 20 years or more. And interestingly, when you compare their risk scores using the instrument that the Department of Corrections in California Department of Corrections Rehabilitations uses, that they're quite heavily concentrated among the lowest risk levels, largely because of their age. So you can very much see how the people serving third strikes is sort of like a large. It's not the majority of people in prison, but it's a sizable sort of minority of folks, and they're distinct in terms of their age, their profile, and how much time they've served.
And this kind of goes to one of the points that the Sentencing Project has made about long sentences, is that you end up incarcerating people past the point when their criminal activity starts to really subside due to age.
Yes, that's true, and I think there's a lot of research by academic criminologists and economists and others who study criminal justice policy that tries to understand the relationship between, removing someone from society and incapacitating them and the impact on public safety. And it is indeed the case that, there's research examples and there's evidence of people who are very criminally active, and, a year in prison will prevent some crime. But what the research seems to suggest is that as people age, that incapacitation effect diminishes because people just commit less crime when they get older. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone. There are people that will commit offenses into advanced age, and there are other people who will desist at very young ages or never commit any offenses over the course of their life. There's a lot of heterogeneity, but it's a strong empirical pattern that is observed, in the population as a whole. And then even among people who can be quite criminally active in their youth, that as people get older, in particular over the age of 30, criminal offending declines. And certainly by the time people are in their 40s and 50s, they're just much less active than they would have been earlier on in their life.
And then you guys highlighted one of, I think, the under recognized features of the three strikes law. Everybody focuses on the third strike, but the second strike is in some ways unique, and it's also very prevalent. And so, what are you guys seeing in terms, and just you mentioned it earlier, but second strike offenses in California, you double the sentence. So that is a substantial penalty, even though it's not 25 to life. Where are you seeing that driving the data here?
Well, it's interesting that is, of the 35% of people in prison, currently at a given point in time with an enhanced sentence, the majority have an enhanced sentence for, a doubled second offense. And again, there's another interesting case where if you look at people admitted to prison and you look at the prison population at a given point in time, you see some very interesting differences in that population. So it's something on the order of, and just to be very specific, we look at everybody admitted to prison between 2015 and early 2022 in California. And what we're seeing is that for those who have a doubling because of a prior serious or violent offense, that the majority are having a doubling of their sentence for an offense that's not serious or violent. But then when you look at the prison population at a given point in time, you see the opposite. So people that are there with a doubled sentence, they're disproportionately, or the majority are people who had a doubled sentence for a serious violent offense. So it's that contrast between the flow, or the people flowing in, and the stock, and how the stock will will largely reflect people who are in the midst of long spells. But the main point that we were trying to, or a pattern that pops out of the data, is that, we think 3 strikes, we think about the person, 3 strikes and you're out in the baseball metaphor, and someone is put away for an interim life term. But really the majority of people that are affected by the law are getting these doubled sentences. And it's quite frequent, right? It's a very, it's commonly applied. You see it. It's probably lengthened the sentences of hundreds of thousands of admissions in the state since the passage of the law. The other thing that's interesting is just reviewing the research body out there on 3 strikes in practice. There are a number of states that have the equivalent of a 3 strikes type law, whether they call it a 3 strikes law or a habitual offender provision in their penal code and their sentencing practices. I'm pretty sure that California is the only one that doubles the sentence for all second offenses for somebody that has one serious or violent. So it's a unique practice in California, and it's one that, for whatever reason, when we passed Prop 36, we focused on the most severe sentence for third strike, but that wasn't considered as something in need of reform at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I first started, one of the first cases I covered was a third strike case where the guy had stolen a bag of shredded cheese. So, you're talking about a $4 crime, and he was facing 25 to life. Because we highlighted the case, eventually the DA decided that this wasn't a good idea. And so they basically agreed to strike a strike, which sounds good in theory, but he ends up still getting 8 years in prison for that, again, relatively minor crime. And this is a guy, definitely probably mentally ill and had a really long record, but it was all these petty offenses, I mean, this wasn't a violent criminal. This was somebody who was, definitely committing crimes and definitely a nuisance, but, 8 years in prison seemed really excessive. And your data is really fascinating because it found that 65% of the admissions to prison with doubled sentences are for nonviolent, non-serious offenses. And as you point out, Prop 36 dealt with the third strike, but they never dealt with, the non-serious second strike offenses.
Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting, I think, one interesting fact that's highlighted in that case that you just recounted is the fact that the district attorney has the discretion to decide whether to proceed with a sort of establishing the facts that there's 2 priors and the person could get the life sentence. And some district attorneys, we highlight one case of a district attorney in Los Angeles who very early on, prior to the passage of Prop 36, had unilaterally sort of established a policy for his associate district attorneys that they weren't going to pursue, they weren't going to pursue third strike sentences for non-serious nonviolence, and that they also weren't going to pursue second strike sentences for subsequent offenses that weren't serious or weren't on the serious or violent list. So, probably some version of that exists in DA's offices across the counties, and then other places are more conservative and are using it more frequently. So that there's a certain degree of which is always true in all states in the United States, right? That there's a state policy, and then there's a lot of discretion afforded to the locality. But in the use of 3 strikes, we definitely see that, there are some places where you're just more likely to be sentenced harshly than others, holding constant the details of one's case.
Yeah, and I think, the consequence is that you have kind of this patchwork or unequal justice across the counties. And so, you see some counties, where there's a high proportion of second and third strikers, and then some counties where there's almost none. And that seems kind of problematic to me.
Yeah, I mean, some of that could certainly reflect differences in, underlying base crime rates or whatever across counties. But in what we had done, we tried to normalize by the amount of felony arresting that was occurring, just the volume of serious offending as measured by that particular arrest metric. And there is that heterogeneity, yeah, and it does it is an indicator of the great power in some ways that operators at the front end of the criminal justice system can have in determining the fate of a case and the fate of a person. And then also just the general heterogeneity and how something is going to be treated based on geography in some ways, right? And it's very unusual. I guess it's not unusual if you grow up and live here in the United States, but perhaps it would be a foreign concept in other countries, just how much regional variation there is in formal law, right? If we look across states at differences in penal code and sentencing practices, but also within a state in how the same penal code is implemented in different county courts.
And also, what do we know about the racial component to all of this?
Well, that's a good question. So we do a little bit of we do have some results in our study where we compare the demographic characteristics of people who are on, just regular determinate sentence without a strike enhancement, people who have a double strike enhancement, and people who have a 3-strike enhancement, and then just look at their age and their age at admission when they committed their offense and the race ethnicity distribution. And for the most part, the prison population overall is, disproportionately African American in California. So it's about 28% African American, and the state population is about 6%. But when you look across these categories, so among those with no strike enhancement, it's about 25% African American. Among those with a double sentenced enhancement, it's about 33%. And then when you go to the people who are serving 25-year to life or a 3rd strike, fully 45% of that population is African American. So the overrepresentation of Black Californians is much greater among the strike enhanced, in particular the 3rd strike enhanced. Interestingly, the proportion Hispanic is, the Hispanic people, Latinos, are still overrepresented among the prison population, but much less so. And as you go across those categories, the percent Hispanic actually declines. So, among no strike enhancements, 48% Hispanic, among double sentence, 43, and when you get to 3rd strike, it's 27. So, the largest disparities, and this is true in other aspects of the criminal justice system in the state, whether you look at, jail populations or people stopped by the police or people searched, that you tend to see the greatest race disparities for African Americans relative to others.
And then, you mentioned a little bit about prosecutorial discretion, but where do we see judicial discretion coming into this?
So I think that there's an interesting history there, because my understanding is the original passage of 3 strikes afforded very little judicial discretion, and then litigation around cases ended up establishing that judges actually do have discretion to limit the application of a strike enhancement in furtherance of justice if they think it's unfair or for other considerations. So that there is room for judges to do that. There's also room, and we see a little bit of evidence of that in the data, that when somebody is being sentenced for, say, a second strike and is facing a double sentence, that it appears that when the offense is for a non-serious, non-violent offense, that there's a slight increase in the proportion, not a slight, I mean, it's a significant increase, but not very large, in the proportion of the offenses that are sentenced to the lower value of the sentencing triad rather than the middle or the upper value. And whether that's resulting from the judge or from the prosecutor, we don't know. But it does appear to suggest that in some instances, even when the triad is being enhanced by that second strike, that actors in the criminal justice system are kind of mitigating it to some degree by choosing that lower triad. But that effect, at least what we see in the data, for people that are in prison, it appears to be on the modest side.
And then finally, you guys had found that the implementation of three strikes does not explain statewide declines in crime over time. So how did you determine that?
Well, we started by reviewing a number of research studies, some of which were looking, were conducted right after the three strikes was implemented. And what you do see if you look at crime trends in the state is that with, right after the passage of three strikes, so three strikes passes in 1994, both via acts by the state legislature as well as via voter initiative. And in the subsequent years, you see large declines in crime, in both violent and property crime. And so there were initial assessments at the time that were claiming that, because of the coincidence of those two trends, that three strikes had a big impact on crime. But when you look more deeply at the data, you see that crime was already trending down in the couple of years before, so it was a continuation of trend. There was research by a law faculty member and his colleagues from UC Berkeley, a scholar named Frank Zimmering, who was kind of the first to point out that when you look at people that are being arrested, admitted to prison, the proportion that were kind of three strikes eligible was not shrinking, right? So you didn't see kind of a change in the composition that would suggest a behavioral response. And then I think perhaps the most kind of puzzling thing is that when you look at states that didn't pass three strikes laws, especially states that had crime rates that parallel California's trends in the pre-period, that their crime rates fell in lockstep with California's, especially the violent crime rate. And that, that's true for both violent and property crime, that the country experienced pronounced increases in lethal violence and serious violence in the late 80s and early 90s. And California, among the 50 states, was sort of near the top of the pack. And then it peaked, and crime rates declined quite precipitously over the next 20 years. And essentially that happened in states without three strikes. It happened in states with three strikes. It happened in states that passed three strikes that were much weaker than California's. It happened in California, where we had a really stiff three strikes. And so there was just a general trend in the country that for whatever reason, crime was falling. And so you don't have a departure of California from these other places. And so from that, one would infer that three strikes is probably not what was going on.
From what you've studied so far, do you think that three strikes is driving mass incarceration in California?
Well, California actually at the moment has an incarceration rate which is now lower than it was prior to three strikes passing. So we had at its peak around 2007, 2008, a prison population that was almost 170,000. Right. And also a smaller overall population for the state. And now we're down to below 100,000. So, and a lot of that can be attributable to very specific reforms, right? So realignment in 2011, Prop 47 in 2014, probably Prop 57 that passed 2016 that made it sort of increasing proportions of people eligible for early release depending on the on the aspects of their offense. And then also, crime has been trending down, and so there's less people that are committing offenses that make them prison eligible. So in some ways, we've almost halved our prison population while keeping 3 strikes there, right? So we still have a high incarceration rate by international standards, but relative to the rest of the country, our state went from being at the middle of the pack to, right there at the national average, to being way below national average, and given our size, actually dragging the national average down. It's kind of a fascinating story. But it is the case that when we look at the current population, right, that, a lot of those reforms were targeted at people that were, convicted of non-serious nonviolence, that don't have histories, that are convicted of or being tried for offenses that are wobblers, where they could be charged as either a misdemeanor or as felony. And, the 3-strike population are folks who are convicted of felonies, oftentimes convicted of serious felonies, and get long prison sentences. And so when we look at our current prison population, right, what we see is that, 3 strikes is a very important contributor at the moment, right? That of the 98,000 or so people that are still in prison, right, that now it's a third have these very long sentences. So it's a big contributor, right? And it definitely makes our prison population in equilibrium higher than it would be in the absence of that law. But I think it is also important to note that the state in many ways has been kind of at the forefront of sort of reducing its use of prison, and we've actually progressed way beyond what many other states have done since 2011.
Are we seeing the use of 3 strikes go down, or is it steady?
Well, at least for the 2nd strike, it appears to be fairly steady and frequently used. 3rd strikes, on the other hand, and again, largely as a result of Prop 36 in 2012, is relatively rare, right? So of people admitted to prison from 2015, 2022, it's under 1% of people that are getting that. But when we look at any given point in time, given that those folks get very long sentences, they tend to accumulate, and we see that it's about 7 or 8% of people that are 3 strikes. So it's a mixed bag. The doubling is used very frequently, and probably consistently so since the law was passed. 3rd strike 25-year life sentences are relatively rare compared to what was happening in the early or in the late 1990s and 2000s.
And I don't know if you want to wade into this, but I'll ask it anyway. From a normative perspective, I mean, what seems to be the most problematic aspect of the 3 strikes law?
Well, I mean, I think there are many different thoughts about what should constitute a just and fair sentence for criminal offending. There are people who motivate or who believe that sentences should somehow be based on I guess re-articulating the values of society and making sure that people receive a sentence that's proportionate and to the harm that they've caused. And there are issues. I mean, sometimes people are receiving a 3rd strike sentence for very severe offenses where they're causing quite a bit of harm. And sometimes they're receiving them for offenses that perhaps are not as severe. They're serious or violent by statute, but one might question whether or not they really merited a 25-year to life sentence. And so I think there are issues there that are raised about equity and proportionality and whether the sentence somehow fits the crime. And I think anytime we have a one-size-fits-all or these types of sentencing practices that are inflexible, these issues are going to arise. I think the alternative school of thought about sentencing is more consequentialist, which is the idea that we levy out a sentence that somehow is going to produce a benefit in terms of deterrence and perhaps incapacitation for somebody who's going to likely visit harm on others. And I think that this is one, if that's your metric, where the very, very long sentences are hard to justify, right? Because we incarcerate people into very, very, very old ages, and they're oftentimes different people than they were when they committed the offense that landed them in prison. And then by limiting the discretion on the back end, it adds years, it adds cost, it it sort of becomes a little hard to justify. So I think in some ways the normative issues depend on what the motivation for sentencing is, and I think I'm an empirical researcher and economist, and I struggle with sometimes thinking about these normative issues over the years I've studied criminal justice. But they have to be wrestled with, I think, in any one of these sentencing debates. And it's definitely not a science on how you titrate a punishment for an offense, but there are frameworks that we can use to think about fairness and equity, and then also about just the utility of some of our practices that we're trying to through research like this contribute the information needed for people to deliberate.
If people want to read this report, where would they go?
Well, if they just Google the California Policy Lab at UC Berkeley, the webpage will come right up in your search by probably the first or second hit in the search, and there will be on the front page a link to the study that has an executive summary as well as the longer 40-page document.
And we'll try to put a link in the podcast link as well, so that people can refer to the report. It's an interesting report, and it was very thorough. I want to thank you for joining us today and discussing this fascinating issue.
Thank you, David, for having me.
This has been Everyday in Justice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday in Justice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.